Harari. Humanity's most important 4 years have already begun. There have been moments in human history that mattered more than others. Not in the ordinary sense in which some years are more eventful than others, more filled with upheaval and change and drama than the quieter stretches between them, but in the deeper sense of being the moments when the decisions made or not made would determine the shape of everything that followed. When the range of futures that remained possible was genuinely open and the choices made within that window would close some possibilities permanently and open others for generations. These moments are not always recognized as what they are while they are happening. More often, they are recognized only in retrospect, when the consequences of the decisions made in them have become visible, when the pathways not taken have become unmistakably closed, and when the people who lived through the moment without fully understanding its weight must be accounted for historically as people who had an opportunity that they did or did not use. Yuval Noah Harari has made an argument with increasing specificity and increasing urgency that we are living in such a moment right now. Not merely an important time in the ordinary sense, not merely a period of rapid change or significant political instability, but specifically and literally one of the most consequential windows in the entire history of the human species. A window in which decisions being made right now in the next few years about how to develop, deploy, and govern transformative technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, will determine the trajectory of human civilization for decades, possibly centuries, possibly longer. And his most important and most challenging claim is that this window is not merely open, it is already closing. The years that matter most for determining whether the future is one in which genuine human freedom, genuine human agency, and genuine human diversity are preserved or permanently constrained are not in the future. They have already begun. To understand why Harari regards this specific moment as uniquely consequential, it is necessary to understand the specific nature of the technological transition that is currently underway and why this transition is different in kind, not merely in degree, from previous technological transitions that humanity has navigated. The history of human civilization is, in significant part, a history of technological transitions, each of which has profoundly reshaped the conditions of human life, and each of which has, in retrospect, appeared both inevitable and manageable, a matter of adaptation and adjustment within a framework of human nature and human agency that remained fundamentally stable across the transition. The agricultural revolution changed how human beings fed themselves and organized their communities without changing what human beings were. The Industrial Revolution changed how goods were produced and how economies were organized without changing the basic cognitive and biological architecture of the human beings navigating the transformation. The Digital Revolution changed how information was processed and communicated without changing the fundamental capacities of the minds doing the processing and communicating. What is happening now is different in ways that make all of these previous comparisons inadequate. For the first time in history, the transition underway is not a transformation of the tools that human beings use or the conditions within which they live, but a transformation of the human beings themselves and of the systems of intelligence that share and are beginning to compete for dominance of the cognitive landscape of civilization. Artificial intelligence is not a better hammer or a faster communication system. It is a different kind of cognitive entity, one that is already matching human performance across an expanding range of intellectual domains, and that is advancing along a trajectory whose endpoint no one can reliably predict, but that everyone who understands it recognizes as pointing toward forms of capability that dwarf anything currently available. The development of this entity is not occurring slowly, giving societies time to adapt incrementally to each new capability before the next one arrives. It is occurring exponentially, which means that the rate of change is itself accelerating, and that the most consequential capabilities are likely to arrive faster than most social, political, and regulatory systems are designed to respond to. At the same time, Biotechnology is advancing toward the ability to redesign the biological substrate of human intelligence itself. The same decades that will see the most dramatic advances in artificial intelligence will also see the maturation of genetic engineering, neuropharmacology, and brain-computer interface technologies that will give human beings an unprecedented degree of control over the biological basis of cognition, emotion, and identity. The convergence of these two trajectories, artificial intelligence advancing toward and beyond human cognitive capability, while biotechnology advances toward human biological redesign, is the specific combination that makes the current moment so consequential. Not because either trajectory taken alone would be manageable, though each would present significant challenges, but because their convergence within the same historical window creates a situation of compounded, mutually reinforcing transformation at a speed that genuinely challenges the ability of human institutions and human wisdom to govern it adequately. Why are the next 4 years specifically so important? Why does Harari point toward this specific window rather than framing the challenge more diffusely across a longer timescale? The specificity reflects several converging observations about where the key decisions in the development and governance of these technologies currently stand. The regulatory frameworks for artificial intelligence are in formation right now, in specific legislative processes in specific jurisdictions, and the frameworks being established now will shape the norms, the precedents, and the institutional architectures that govern this technology's development and deployment for years and decades. The precedents being set now about what kinds of data collection are permissible, what kinds of algorithmic decision-making require transparency and accountability, what kinds of AI applications are subject to meaningful human oversight, and what kinds may operate autonomously will be the precedents that subsequent regulatory development is built on. Getting these foundations right is enormously easier than correcting them later, after the interests and the technical architectures built around them have become entrenched. Getting them wrong creates trajectories whose correction will require dismantling infrastructure and interests that will be far more powerful and far more resistant to dismantling in the future than they are today. The international governance frameworks for artificial intelligence are similarly in formation right now, at a moment when the concentration of advanced AI capability in a small number of countries and corporations has not yet become so extreme and so entrenched that meaningful international coordination is politically impossible. The window for establishing genuine international agreements about the development, deployment, and military application of artificial intelligence is genuinely open today in ways that it may not be in 10 years, when the competitive advantage that AI capability provides will have become so visible and so consequential that the incentives against sharing it internationally will be far stronger, and the political will to sacrifice competitive advantage for collective governance far weaker. History suggests that the time to establish arms control frameworks is before the weapons have been developed and deployed at scale, not after. The same logic applies to the governance of transformative AI capabilities. The concentration of economic and political power that advanced AI capability enables is accumulating right now at a rate and to a degree that, if not addressed in the current window, will produce concentrations of power that will be structurally self-reinforcing in ways that make them genuinely difficult to reverse. The entities that gain decisive advantage in the development of advanced AI capability will be able to use that advantage to generate the resources that allow them to maintain and extend their advantage, creating feedback loops of capability, resource accumulation, and further capability development that, once established, are very difficult to interrupt from outside. This is a pattern that Harari observes in the historical development of other forms of concentrated power. Power concentrations tend to be self-reinforcing, which means that the most important window for preventing the kind of concentration that becomes genuinely incompatible with meaningful human freedom and democratic governance is the window before the concentration has achieved sufficient scale to be fully self-reinforcing. The culture and the norms that will govern how these technologies are understood, valued, and integrated into human life are being formed right now, in the specific narratives about artificial intelligence and biotechnology that are dominant in the current public conversation. Cultural norms have significant inertia. The assumptions, the metaphors, the frameworks of value and assessment that become established as the common-sense understanding of a technology tend to persist far longer than the technical specifications of the technology itself, shaping what alternatives are imaginable and what critiques are credible long after the specific technical context in which they were formed has changed. The norms being established now about what artificial intelligence is, what it is for, what constraints on its development are appropriate, and what are excessive, what relationship between human beings and algorithmic systems is natural, and what is concerning, will shape the cultural and political landscape within which AI governance debates occur for years. Getting these norms right, or at least getting them in a direction that is more oriented toward genuine human flourishing than toward the interests of the entities developing and deploying the technology, is enormously easier now, while the technology is still new enough that the common sense around it is still genuinely in formation than it will be later, when entrenched narratives and entrenched interests have calcified the conversation. This convergence of specifically consequential decision windows, regulatory international governance, power concentration, and cultural norm formation, all of them open simultaneously and all of them closing on roughly similar timescales, is what Harari means when he says that humanity's most important 4 years have already begun. Not that the next 4 years will be the only important years. The consequences of the decisions made in them will play out for decades. But that the specific window in which the foundational decisions are being made, in which the trajectories are being set, in which the range of futures that remain possible is still broad enough to include both the most hopeful and the most alarming scenarios that the available analysis suggests, is the window that is currently open and that is currently in the process of closing. The urgency of this framing deserves careful examination, because urgency can be used and has been used to justify decisions that would not withstand more careful deliberation. The claim that a specific window is uniquely critical has historically been made in contexts ranging from genuine civilizational emergencies to manipulative political rhetoric, and the ability to distinguish between these requires exactly the kind of careful, evidence-responsive, perspective-taking analysis that urgency tends to suppress. Harari is aware of this, and his claim of urgency is grounded in specific observations about specific technological trajectories and specific institutional dynamics rather than in the vague claim that things have never been more important. The specific observation that grounds the urgency most clearly is the observation about the trajectory of artificial intelligence capability development. The development of AI capability has been accelerating. The capabilities available today were not available 5 years ago. The capabilities likely to be available in 5 years will be significantly greater than those available today. And there are strong reasons, both theoretical and empirical, to believe that the relationship between capability and the social, political, and governance challenges it creates is not linear but exponential, meaning that the difficulty of governing AI capability grows faster than the capability itself. A world in which AI systems are capable of doing what AI systems can do today presents governance challenges of significant but manageable complexity. A world in which AI systems are capable of things we currently regard as qualitatively beyond current capabilities, systems that can conduct sophisticated autonomous research, that can operate strategically across multiple domains simultaneously, that can interact with and potentially improve other AI systems, presents governance challenges of a qualitatively different order. Challenges for which the governance frameworks being developed now will be the primary available instruments regardless of their adequacy. This means that the governance frameworks developed in the current window will be required to handle challenges significantly greater than those that currently motivate their development, that their adequacy will be tested by situations their designers did not anticipate, and that the resilience and adaptability built into them now will determine how effectively they can handle those unanticipated situations. Building governance frameworks that are adequate to the challenges of today but will be severely strained by the challenges of tomorrow is a form of insufficient preparation that is both very common in the history of technology governance and very consequential in its effects. The window to build more robust frameworks, frameworks adequate to the challenges likely to emerge, rather than only the challenges currently visible, is the window that is currently open. What does Harari believe should actually happen in these 4 years? What specific choices made by specific actors would make the most significant positive difference to the trajectory of human civilization in the period that follows? He is, consistent with his characteristic intellectual honesty, more confident about what needs to be done in broad terms than about the specific mechanisms by which it should be done, because the specific mechanisms depend on political, technical, and institutional realities that are both highly context-specific and rapidly changing. But the broad terms are worth taking seriously because they point in directions that are sufficiently clear to provide genuine orientation even in the absence of complete specificity. The most fundamental thing that needs to happen, in Harari's analysis, is the development of genuine international cooperation on the governance of transformative AI. Cooperation that goes beyond the existing forms of bilateral dialogue and multilateral statement and involves the creation of genuinely binding frameworks with genuine enforcement mechanisms, frameworks that limit the development and deployment of the most dangerous capabilities regardless of competitive incentives to develop and deploy them. This is genuinely difficult, for the same reasons that all international governance of powerful technologies is difficult, the same reasons that nuclear arms control has been partial and fragile rather than comprehensive and durable, the same reasons that climate agreements have been slow to develop and slower to produce adequate action. The difficulty is real. But the alternative, the continuation of a competitive dynamic in which each major AI power develops the most powerful AI capabilities it can as quickly as it can, without meaningful international oversight for both commercial and strategic advantage, is a trajectory whose likely outcomes include exactly the kinds of concentrated, unchecked power that history consistently identifies as among the most dangerous arrangements for human freedom. The second thing that needs to happen is the development of domestic regulatory frameworks that are adequate to the actual challenges of the technology rather than to the political difficulty of constraining the industries developing it. The pattern of technology regulation in the digital era has been characterized by significant lag between the deployment of transformative technologies and the development of regulatory frameworks adequate to govern their effects, lag measured not in months but in decades, during which the technologies have become so embedded in economic and social infrastructure that even clearly inadequate regulatory frameworks face enormous resistance from the interests that have built themselves around the absence of meaningful constraint. Breaking this pattern for artificial intelligence, developing regulatory frameworks that are genuinely adequate to the challenges while those challenges are still at a scale that makes regulation feasible, requires a degree of regulatory foresight and regulatory political will that has historically been rare. It also requires the development of regulatory institutions with the technical sophistication to understand what they are regulating, institutions that do not currently exist at adequate scale in most jurisdictions and that will not develop overnight. The third thing that needs to happen is the broadening of the conversation about AI governance well beyond the communities that currently dominate it. The development of governance frameworks for transformative technology should not be primarily the project of the technology industry, the technology research community, and a small number of policy specialists with the technical background to engage with the substance. It should involve the full range of communities whose lives will be shaped by the technology, which is to say, effectively, everyone. This broadening of the conversation requires the development of what might be called AI literacy at the level of the general public, not technical understanding in the engineering sense, but functional understanding of what these systems are, what they do, what interests they serve, what risks they create, and what kinds of governance choices are available. A democracy cannot make genuinely informed collective choices about AI governance if the majority of its citizens do not understand what AI is at a sufficient level to engage meaningfully with the governance questions. Developing that understanding is itself one of the most urgent tasks of the current window. The fourth thing that needs to happen concerns the relationship between AI development and the concentration of economic power, a relationship that the current development trajectory is producing in ways that should concern anyone who values the kind of economic diversity and distributed economic power that genuine democratic governance requires. The development of advanced AI capability is currently concentrated in a small number of large corporations, with resources and data advantages that are very difficult for smaller actors to match. This concentration is already producing and is likely to continue producing significant barriers to meaningful competition, barriers that are self-reinforcing in the way that Harari has identified as characteristic of historically consequential power concentrations. Addressing this concentration requires regulatory frameworks specifically designed to prevent the most egregious forms of it, requirements that prevent the largest actors from using their data and resource advantages to foreclose competitive development of AI capabilities by a broader range of actors, and affirmative support for the development of open and accessible AI infrastructure that does not require dependence on any single corporate actor. Beyond these specific institutional requirements, Harari emphasizes the importance of a quality of public engagement with the current moment that goes beyond the consumption of content about AI and involves the genuine exercise of democratic agency in the governance decisions currently being made. The governance of transformative technology is not a technical question that should be delegated to experts while the public passively waits for the outcome. It is a question of values, of what kind of future human beings want to inhabit, what forms of power concentration they are willing to accept, and what they wish to resist, what aspects of human experience they wish to protect from redesign, and what they are willing to have transformed. These are questions that require broad public deliberation rather than expert determination, and the quality of that deliberation will be determined by the degree to which citizens understand the actual choices available, the actual consequences of different paths, and the actual interests and arguments of the parties seeking to influence those choices in specific directions. The 4 years that Harari identifies as humanity's most important are not 4 years in which a small number of brilliant or powerful people will make the decisions that determine the future. They are 4 years in which the aggregate of millions of individual and collective choices about what to demand from political representatives, what to support and what to oppose in the development of AI governance, what norms to reinforce and what narratives to challenge in the cultural conversation about AI, will collectively determine the trajectory of the technology and the governance frameworks that shape its effects. No single choice made by any single actor in these 4 years is likely to be decisively consequential by itself. The consequence will be the aggregate, and the aggregate will be shaped by the quality of understanding that the people making the individual choices bring to them. This is why Harari regards the development of public understanding of the current situation as not merely educationally valuable, but politically urgent. A public that understands what is at stake in AI governance decisions is a public that is equipped to exercise the democratic pressure that adequate governance requires. A public that does not understand, that experiences the development of artificial intelligence as a phenomenon happening around them, rather than a set of choices being made by identifiable actors in response to political and economic incentives that public pressure could in principle influence, is a public that has effectively delegated the most important governance decisions of its era to the small number of actors whose interests are most directly engaged, which is to say, primarily, the actors whose interests are least reliably aligned with the broad human interest. The next 4 years will pass regardless of whether they are inhabited with the quality of awareness and engagement that they require. The decisions will be made. The trajectories will be set. The window will close. What remains genuinely open is the question of whether it closes with or without the quality of collective human deliberation that its consequences warrant. That question is not answered in laboratories or in boardrooms or in legislative chambers, though all of those matter. It is answered in the aggregate of choices made by the millions of people who understand clearly enough what is happening to bring genuine awareness to the choices available to them in their specific lives, their specific communities, and their specific political contexts. Harari has said that he does not know whether humanity will navigate the current transition successfully. The uncertainty is genuine, not rhetorical. The challenges are real. The institutional capacities currently available to address them are genuinely insufficient, and the timeline is genuinely compressed. But he has also said, with equal consistency, that the outcome is not predetermined, that the future is genuinely open in ways that make the quality of human engagement with the current moment genuinely consequential. Not in the sense that any one person or group controls the outcome, but in the sense that the aggregate of human choices, made with more or less awareness, more or less wisdom, more or less genuine commitment to the values that the most important choices in these years implicate, will be the primary determinant of what kind of future emerges from the window currently open. Humanity's most important 4 years have already begun. The clock is running. The decisions are being made. The future is being shaped. The only question that remains is whether the shaping is being done by people who understand what they are doing, or whether the most consequential decisions about the human future are being made, as so many consequential decisions throughout history have been made, in the presence of people who were too busy managing the immediate to attend to the consequential. You are here. You are attending. That is already different from the default. Now do something with the difference. The window is open, the moment is now, and the years that will determine everything have already begun. To understand the specific significance of the 4-year window with greater precision, it is useful to examine the concrete domains in which the most consequential decisions are currently being made and why each of these domains represents a window that is genuinely open now but that will not remain equally open indefinitely. Each domain has its own specific dynamics, its own specific actors and interests, and its own specific timeline for the closing of the decision window. Together, they constitute the landscape of the most important 4 years, and understanding each of them specifically helps to understand why the urgency Harari identifies is real rather than rhetorical. The first domain is the governance of large language models and generative AI systems, the specific class of artificial intelligence systems that has achieved the most dramatic public visibility in the last several years, and that has begun the most immediate transformation of knowledge work, creative production, and information dynamics across many sectors of economic and social life. The governance questions for these systems involve decisions about what training data is permissible, what outputs are permissible, what level of transparency is required about how the systems work and what data was used to create them, what accountability mechanisms exist for harmful outputs, and what forms of use by whom in what contexts are subject to what kinds of regulatory oversight. These decisions are being made right now in specific regulatory proceedings in specific jurisdictions, and the frameworks being established will shape the development and deployment of these systems for years. The window is open because the regulatory frameworks are still in early formation. In Europe, the European Union's AI Act has established the most comprehensive framework currently in existence. But its implementation is ongoing, and its effects on the actual behavior of the major AI developers and deployers are still working themselves out. In the United States, the regulatory framework is fragmented, contested, and significantly shaped by the political dynamics of an administration whose posture toward AI regulation has significant consequences for the global regulatory environment. In China, the regulatory framework reflects a different set of priorities and values, with significant implications for the competitive dynamics of global AI development. The international alignment, or lack thereof, between these different regulatory approaches will significantly determine whether the regulatory frameworks that emerge are adequate to the global nature of the technology's effects, or whether regulatory arbitrage, the ability to develop and deploy in jurisdictions with less restrictive frameworks, renders the more protective frameworks ineffective in practice. The window is also open because the major AI developers, while currently the most powerful actors in determining the trajectory of the technology, have not yet fully consolidated the economic, political, and technical advantages that would make them effectively ungovernable by democratic institutions. The consolidation is occurring. The revenues being generated by the deployment of AI capabilities are funding the development of more powerful capabilities, the lobbying that shapes the regulatory environment, and the capture of talent and data that makes meaningful competition increasingly difficult. But the process is not complete, and the window in which democratic institutions retain meaningful power to shape the trajectory rather than merely responding to the accomplished fact of the trajectory that has already been established is still open, though it is narrowing. The second domain is the military application of artificial intelligence. a domain whose governance questions are among the most consequential and whose current state of governance is among the most inadequate relative to the stakes involved. Autonomous weapons, AI systems capable of identifying and engaging targets without meaningful human decision-making in the loop, are currently in development in several countries and have already been deployed in limited forms in several conflict zones. The international legal framework for governing autonomous weapons is almost entirely absent. The existing international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict that govern what is permissible in warfare, was not designed with autonomous AI systems in mind and does not clearly address the specific challenges they raise about accountability, proportionality, and distinction between combatants and civilians that are central to the framework's underlying values. The window for establishing meaningful international governance of autonomous weapons and the military application of AI more broadly is open now, when the capabilities are still sufficiently limited that meaningful constraints are technically feasible, and when the competitive military advantage that unconstrained development might provide has not yet become so visible and so large that the political will to constrain development has collapsed entirely. Historical analogy is instructive here. The window for establishing meaningful governance of nuclear weapons was largest in the years immediately after the first weapons were developed, but before they had proliferated to the point where the interests in maintaining existing arsenals had become entrenched. The arms control frameworks that were eventually established, however partial and however fragile, were significantly easier to achieve in the earlier stages of nuclear development than they would have been later. The same logic applies to autonomous weapons and AI military applications. The window for establishing meaningful governance is open now, in ways it may not be in 10 years, when autonomous weapons will have been deployed more widely, when the military advantages they provide will have been demonstrated more clearly, and when the interests in maintaining them and developing more capable versions will be more powerful and more politically organized. The third domain is the governance of biotech and its intersection with AI, a domain whose governance challenges are somewhat longer in their development timeline, but whose decisions in the current window will be equally consequential. The ability to sequence, analyze, and eventually edit the human genome has been developing for decades, but the combination of AI capabilities for analyzing biological systems with gene editing technologies for modifying them is producing an acceleration of biotechnology capability whose implications for human biological diversity and equality are as significant as the implications of AI for cognitive diversity and equality. The specific question of who will have access to biological enhancements, what enhancements will be permissible to make to germline DNA that will be inherited by subsequent generations, and what regulatory frameworks will govern the international development and deployment of these technologies are questions whose answers are being shaped now, in the early stages of the technology's development, in ways that will establish precedents and norms that subsequent development will be built on. The governance window for biotechnology is somewhat longer than for AI because the capabilities are developing somewhat more slowly, but the relevant decisions are being made now. The international governance frameworks for germline genetic modification are inadequate at present, with a moratorium on clinical application of germline editing that is broadly observed but whose durability and enforceability in the context of significant competitive and commercial pressures are genuinely uncertain. The window for establishing more robust and more broadly endorsed frameworks is open now, and closing it without establishing adequate governance would be a specific and consequential failure with very long-term effects. The fourth domain is the specific concentration of economic power that AI capability is enabling, and the governance question of whether that concentration will be addressed or allowed to continue uninterrupted to the point where it becomes self-reinforcing and politically irreversible. The companies at the frontier of AI development are generating revenues and accumulating resources at rates that are among the most rapid in the history of capitalism, and those revenues are being reinvested in the development of further AI capabilities, the acquisition of the data and the talent required for that development, and the lobbying and political influence that shapes the regulatory environment within which they operate. The trajectory, if uninterrupted, leads toward concentrations of economic and therefore political power that would be genuinely unprecedented in the democratic era, and that would create structural challenges to meaningful democratic governance that would be very difficult to address after the concentrations have fully solidified. The window for addressing this concentration is open now, while the concentrations, though already significant, have not yet achieved the degree of self-reinforcement that would make them structurally irreversible. The antitrust frameworks of most jurisdictions were not designed with AI capability concentration in mind and are genuinely inadequate to the specific forms of competitive advantage that AI capability provides. But the development of more adequate frameworks, while politically difficult given the lobbying power of the companies whose business models they would constrain, is still politically possible in ways that it may not be after those companies have had another decade to consolidate their advantages and their political influence. Beyond these specific institutional domains, Harari identifies the current window as crucial for the formation of the specific cultural understanding of what is actually happening, the shared public narrative about AI, and its implications that will shape the political will and the political imagination available for the governance decisions that need to be made. The cultural narrative about AI is currently in active formation. The dominant narratives are being shaped by a combination of the marketing of the companies developing the technology, the popular science and journalism covering it, the entertainment industry's representations of it, and the public intellectual discourse that attempts to make sense of what is happening and where it is leading. None of these sources of narrative formation is primarily oriented toward producing the kind of accurate, nuanced, governance-relevant understanding that the current moment requires, though each contributes to the cultural conversation in ways that matter. The window for shaping the cultural narrative is genuinely open now, when the common sense about AI is still being formed, and when accurate, thoughtful, governance-oriented narratives can still enter the conversation and achieve significant reach before the narrative has calcified into forms that will be very difficult to challenge. The years in which the basic cultural understanding of what AI is and what it means for human life, human freedom and human governance is established are the years in which the political will for adequate governance is also being formed. The relationship is not deterministic, but it is real. Cultures that develop accurate and appropriately serious understandings of transformative technologies create the conditions for more adequate governance than cultures that develop primarily optimistic, novelty-focused, or dismissive understandings of the same technologies. And the process by which the understanding develops is happening right now, in real time, in the specific content being produced and consumed, the specific conversations being had, the specific narratives being established and challenged in the current window. The 4 years that Harari identifies as humanity's most important are also, and this is perhaps the most personally significant dimension of the argument, the 4 years in which each individual who understands what is at stake faces the most consequential version of a choice that is always available but rarely so clearly pivotal. The choice between engagement and withdrawal, between accepting the responsibility that comes with understanding and managing that responsibility by limiting understanding, between bringing one's specific capacities and one's specific position to bear on the most important challenges available and reserving those capacities for less consequential but more manageable demands. This is not a comfortable framing, and Harari does not present it as one. The responsibility that genuine understanding of the current moment generates is real and is not dischargeable by knowledge alone. Understanding what is at stake is the beginning of the responsibility, not the fulfillment of it. The fulfillment requires bringing that understanding into the specific choices available in specific lives, the political choices, the consumer choices, the professional choices, the choices about where to invest attention and energy, and the specific forms of influence that specific individuals and specific positions provide, in ways that are oriented toward the governance outcomes that the stakes of the moment require. Not everyone has equal access to the most consequential decisions being made in the current window. The people making the specific regulatory choices, the specific international governance decisions, the specific technology deployment choices that will most directly determine the trajectory of the next decades, are a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of positions. But the political, cultural, and institutional conditions within which those decisions are made are shaped by a far broader range of people and a far broader range of choices, and the quality of those conditions, the degree to which they generate genuine political pressure for adequate governance and genuine cultural support for the values that adequate governance requires, will significantly influence the specific choices made by the specific actors most directly involved. This is the democracy of the current moment, not the formal democracy of voting, though that matters, but the deeper democracy of the aggregate of choices made by people who understand what they are choosing and why it matters, whose understanding generates the political will and the cultural norms and the institutional pressure that determine the conditions within which the most consequential decisions are made. The people whose choices aggregate into that broader condition are not the people with the most power in the formal institutional sense. They are the people with the most awareness, and awareness is the resource whose concentration in the current moment is most consequential for the outcome. Humanity's most important 4 years have already begun. The clock has been running since the moment the current generation of AI capabilities began demonstrating that the threshold of genuine civilizational consequence had been crossed. The decisions are being made. The trajectories are being set. The window is genuinely open and genuinely closing. And the question of whether it closes with or without the quality of awareness and engagement that its consequences require is the most important question available to anyone who understands clearly enough what is being asked. You are one of the people who understands. That is not a small thing. It is, in the specific conditions of the current moment, one of the most important things a person can be. Now bring it to bear on what you know, on what you choose, on what you say and what you demand, and what you refuse to accept as adequate to the stakes of the years that have already irrevocably begun. The future is being made right now, by choices being made right now, by people who are or are not attending to what they are actually choosing. Attend, choose, act. The window is open. This is the moment, and it will not wait.